Welcome to Shenanigans Ensue with
Mary SanGiovanni!
Hi folks, welcome to Cosmic Shenanigans. I'm Mary SanGiovanni, and as always, I'm up to shenanigans of cosmic proportions. Today is going to be kind of a different, slightly different take on the show. I'm going to be doing a Lovecraft reading, and we'll be discussing the story a little bit at the end. Essentially, throughout the series here, I like to include a little bit of the source material for cosmic horror and why I think it has the influence that it does on cosmic horror in general, both contemporarily for the time and in present day on modern cosmic horror. So this particular story, it's a short one. It's called Dagon, and I'm going to do the quick reading of this, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think for my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we, of her crew, were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners. So liberal indeed was the discipline of our captors that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for unaccounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastness of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awaked, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was, in reality, more horrified than astonished, for there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish and of other less describable things, which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing in sight save a vast reach of black slime, yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions which, for innumerable millions of years, had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me, that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears as I might, nor were there any sea-fowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness, and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning, I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation in the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day still traveled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance, an intervening valley settling it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illumine. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Though my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost and of Satan's hideous climb to the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks, and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian depths, where no light had yet penetrated. All at once, my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me, an object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself, but I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith, whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, showed weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions and almost slapping my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the Cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, and unlike anything I had ever seen in books, consisting for the most part of conventionalized aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water, on account of their enormous size, were an array of bas-reliefs whose subjects would have excited the envy of a Doré. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shewn disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint. Grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer, they were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seem to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background, for one of the creatures was shewn in the act of killing a whale, represented as but little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe, some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into a past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing whilst the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then I suddenly saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, Polyphemus-like, and loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, the while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal, and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm some time after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard peals of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium, I had said much, but found that my works had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist, and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god. But soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug is given only transient surcease, and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account for the information or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men. Often I ask myself if it could not all have been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man-o'-war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may at this very moment be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols, and carving their own detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of a puny, war-exhausted mankind. Of a day when the land shall sink, and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as of some immense, slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that band, the window. So that's Dagon. Now, one of the reasons I chose this, is because, and we're just going to go briefly through, because the reading itself took some time, and I don't want to hold everybody up for a long time, but one of the reasons I picked Dagon is, to me, it is a precursor to The Shadow over Innismouth. I think it explains a little bit more background, if you will, about the fish people that seem so prominent, an ongoing creature in a lot of Lovecraft stuff. When I think of this type of cosmic horror, Lovecraftian cosmic horror, I'm struck by the fact, again, that whereas modern cosmic horror tends to look at not the revelation of the monster, but the impact of that revelation in an ongoing sense to the characters as the horror itself, or their own reactions as the horror. In Lovecraft's work, it was the revelation, often, which was meant to be the horror, and that revelation's implication that there is an other out there, an alien force out there, which threatens to invade or encroach on life as we know it. Now, some other interesting things about this particular story, though, come up that are both reflective of pre-Lovecraftian cosmic horror and also, I think, somewhat of a deviation for Lovecraft, which I think are interesting. There is an idea, a pervasive idea, of nature as a god itself, that certain elements of nature are almost paranormal or supernatural forces in and of themselves. We've seen this a lot with Blackwood, with Arthur Machen, that sort of idea of, the gods personified in natural elements, and that these natural elements are greater than us and indifferent to us. With Lovecraft, a lot of times that personification of nature was the ocean. And I cannot say for sure, as I think probably other Lovecraft scholars would know better. I can't say if he was necessarily afraid of the ocean, but clearly it held a fascination for him, a sense of terror and awe, which comes through in a lot of his work. A lot of his monsters are marine-like in their structure. If they manage to be physical enough to even be described, they are often very aquatic looking. I think that possibly before, in the decades and centuries before we started exploring space, ocean was that great unknown, that great vast, seemingly endless unknown of possibility and of possible horror. It was something that gave life and often took it away, probably more often took it away. It was a vast, and vast being 3/4 of the planet vast, landscape, or seascape, I guess, of creatures that we couldn't even fathom. That would look like, the closest we have to alien life is what we find in the ocean, what we find at the bottom of the sea. And I think that there's that particular reflection, there's a pagan saying, as above, so below, and they mean, as, what is inside is outside, what is in the sky is also on the land or in the water. And I think that for Lovecraft, the ocean was a reflection of space, and that the monsters therein were reflections of the endless possibilities of, if you think about it, if we have such a vastly unexplored and not understood part of our own world, which makes up 3/4 of our world, then how much more insignificant must we be in the grand scheme of things if we don't even understand most of our own planet? And I think that idea terrified him, that the ocean was sort of a portal to change, the same way that nowadays space is a portal to change. The other aspect I think that I wanted to cover real quick about this, that does not come up in a lot of Lovecraft's work, but did come up in a lot of the ghost stories prior to Lovecraft, M.R. James kind of things, which I don't generally tend to consider cosmic horror, is this idea of war. Lovecraft only ever mentions war, to the best of my knowledge, in his fiction when it comes to wars between entities we couldn't possibly imagine. Wars that are so big and above us and over our heads that half the time, we just assume that they're natural catastrophes and calamities and just roll with it. But he mentions, and it's subtle, but there's sort of this idea of the impact of war on the sanity and sense of self of the character. And I find this interesting because, one, Lovecraft's characters don't tend to be the kind of people that we tend to think of as soldiers. They tend to be very isolated, probably not good team players, not good people. They tend to be more intellectual than athletic. And here we have a story from a soldier. And I think that it's interesting in this respect because often the connotation of the military, and I'm trying to say this in a careful way because I don't mean this as an offense, but the connotation of a soldier is as someone who does what he or she is told. Somebody who embraces, a communal purpose and follows orders. Now, that in and of itself, you could say Lovecraft is saying that there is not a sense of identity or autonomy in being a soldier, and that does fit with his worldview that people are somewhat insignificant as individuals. But to look at the potential trauma of war and how that may have affected an individual's sanity, an individual's perception of the world, or just an individual's circumstance that he may be that one person that learns something different about the world, I think is an interesting character deviation. Now, my understanding is that this was one of his earlier stories. I think you can tell that a little bit about the language, because I feel that this is one of those stories where he's still mimicking the writers he's read, the writers who use a very antiquated and formal language. And we can see, in the course of the stories that he's written over time, that some of his philosophies do change, or at least are slightly modified as he gets older. But I do think it's an interesting thing, and again, a sort of precursor to modern horror is understanding and exploring the sense of identity, especially individual identity in the face of proof that we are not alone, that we're not alone in the ocean, we're not alone in the universe, that we're not alone as the only sentient beings capable of running a planet. That the essential horror there is that there are creatures out there who are bigger and more powerful than us, and to whom we are insignificant. And again, so that comes around again to sort of full circle to Lovecraft's idea that really the revelation of our insignificance and of our insecurity, the safety net by which we have, threaded our sense of reality throughout, is not there, or it is not what we thought. And I think that, although often overlooked as a short story, Dagon is one of those tales that, maybe without his knowing, bridges the gap between Lovecraftian cosmic horror and modern cosmic horror. And I think is, despite Lovecraft's inherent racism and nationalism, I think it is a little bit forward thinking, at least in the sense that we're looking at the experiences of the individual and how they directly or indirectly tie into cosmic horror. And I think that's kind of an impressive thing about this particular story. So that was Dagon by Lovecraft. And next week we'll be talking about more non-Lovecraft cosmic horror. And I really appreciate you listening. If you like this episode and would like to hear past episodes or future episodes, or in a whole time crunch loop, past, present, and future all are one, you can go to Project Entertainment Network. We're on there. We're on iTunes and Spotify, Stitcher, all places basically for free where podcasts are broadcast to you and the rest of the world. This week, we do not have engineer Dave Thomas. His health is not good. He is in the hospital. We wish Dave the best of health and a speedy recovery. But we have Matt Wilderson, guest Matt Wilderson, who has been on the podcast before and also co-hosts the Horror Show with Brian Keene and hosts Grindcast in his very own Fancy Pants studio, which is full of all kinds of cool cosmic horror stuff and video game stuff and books and movies and toys and all kinds of other wonderful things. So thank you to Matt this week for helping engineer this show. And if you are interested in listening to me talk about other things, both academic and not academic, you can listen to The Horror Show with Brian Keene and all the same platforms where you listen to Cosmic Shenanigans. And thanks for joining me. I'll see you next week. Bye.